It began as a routine evening inside Windsor Castle at least. That's what palace staff believed. But when Princess Anne unexpectedly entered the royal library and discovered Queen Camilla's son lingering near a restricted archive cabinet, everything changed. Within hours, security officers were reviewing footage. Senior aides were summoned behind closed doors, and whispers spread through every corridor of the palace. What those cameras allegedly captured would soon ignite one of the most explosive internal investigations in recent royal memory. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For generations, the royal library had existed as more than a collection of books and records. It was a vault of memory, a silent witness to triumphs, scandals, private correspondence, and decisions that shaped the future of the monarchy. Most people inside the palace never came close to its most protected sections. Access was tightly controlled, permissions were carefully documented, and every movement near the restricted archives was expected to follow strict protocol. That was why the events of that evening sent such a chill through the institution. Reports circulating among palace staff suggested that Princess Anne had not planned to visit the library at all. Various accounts described her arrival as unexpected, even spontaneous. Yet what she allegedly encountered immediately raised questions. According to whispers that quickly spread through administrative offices, a figure who was not normally associated with archive work had been seen near one of the most sensitive storage areas inside the building. No alarms sounded, no confrontation erupted, but those familiar with royal procedures understood something important had happened. The moment Anne reportedly paused and demanded an explanation. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Staff members who had been finishing routine duties suddenly found themselves answering urgent questions. Security personnel were contacted. Access records were quietly requested. Senior aides who normally ended their evenings hours earlier were called back into private meetings. No official statement emerged, but silence inside royal institutions often speaks louder than public announcements. The absence of explanations only fueled speculation. By midnight, rumors had begun moving beyond Windsor's walls. Some suggested a misunderstanding. Others believed a serious breach of protocol had occurred. Palace insiders reportedly debated whether authorization had been granted or whether someone had ventured into an area they were never supposed to enter. Every theory seemed more dramatic than the last, and yet no one appeared willing to dismiss the matter outright. What made the situation even more unsettling was Princess Anne herself. Known throughout royal circles for her unwavering commitment to duty, Anne was not someone who reacted dramatically without reason. Those who had worked alongside her for years understood that she valued facts over emotion and procedure over politics. If she had concerns, people listened. If she requested answers, answers were expected. Her reported involvement transformed what might have been an ordinary administrative issue into something far more serious. As security teams quietly began reviewing footage and officials gathered fragments of information from multiple sources, a growing sense of unease settled over the palace. Everyone seemed to be asking the same question. Why had he been there? What had he been looking for? And perhaps most importantly, who had given permission, if anyone had given it at all? Those questions would soon lead investigators toward a discovery that threatened to shake confidence inside the royal household itself. But the mystery surrounding his presence was only the beginning, because hidden inside those archives was something far more sensitive than anyone realized. For decades, the Windsor Library housed more than rare books and historic manuscripts. Behind locked doors sat confidential royal records, private correspondence, and documents connected to generations of monarchs. Access was strictly controlled, yet reports suggest someone may have crossed a line that even senior royals rarely approached. The questions surrounding that evening only intensified as officials began examining the location at the center of the controversy. To outsiders, the Windsor Library represented history, tradition, and scholarship, but those familiar with its inner workings understood that certain sections carried a far greater significance. Deep within its protected archives rested documents tied to some of the most sensitive chapters of royal life. Generations of monarchs had left behind private letters, personal records, internal memoranda, and correspondence that offered an extraordinary glimpse into the pose and decisions that shaped the crown. These were not merely historical artifacts. They were pieces of the monarchy's institutional memory, preserved with extraordinary care and protected by rules that had evolved over decades. That was precisely why the growing concerns inside the palace could not be dismissed as ordinary gossip. Palace insiders reportedly described the restricted archive area as one of the most tightly controlled locations within the royal household's administrative structure. Entry permissions were carefully monitored, visitor records were maintained, access was granted only when necessary, and even then, it often required multiple levels of authorization. The entire system existed for one purpose: ensuring that sensitive information remained secure and protected from unauthorized examination. As discussions continued behind closed doors, attention increasingly shifted away from who had been seen near the archive cabinet and toward a far more unsettling possibility. What if something had been accessed? What if someone had been searching for something specific? Those questions lingered over every conversation. The uncertainty itself became a source of anxiety. In institutions built on protocol and discretion, unanswered questions can be more disruptive than confirmed facts. Reports suggest Princess Anne quickly recognized the seriousness of the situation. Known for her direct approach and unwavering respect for royal procedures, she allegedly demanded a complete review of every available access record connected to the restricted section. Nothing, according to palace whispers, was to be overlooked. Entry logs were requested, visitor permissions were examined, administrative records were cross-checked. The goal was simple: establish a clear timeline and determine exactly who had entered the archive area and when. Yet the deeper officials looked, the more complicated the situation appeared to become. Some records reportedly raised new questions rather than providing answers. Certain details failed to align neatly with initial assumptions. Staff members who had expected a quick resolution suddenly found themselves facing a growing list of uncertainties. The focus of the inquiry gradually shifted toward one central mystery. If someone had indeed entered a protected section of the archive, what exactly had they been looking for? That question echoed throughout Windsor and beyond. Some whispered about historical correspondence. Others speculated about family records, inheritance documents, or confidential files connected to past royal decisions. Every theory seemed plausible. Every possibility carried consequences. And with each passing hour, the pressure on those conducting the inquiry continued to grow. What made the situation especially troubling was the realization that the answer might already exist somewhere within the palace's security system. If access logs could not tell the entire story, perhaps the cameras could. Technicians were soon tasked with examining every available recording, hoping the footage would reveal what paperwork could not. But as preparations began for that review, another unsettling possibility started taking shape. The real mystery might not involve what happened during the encounter itself. It might involve events that occurred long before anyone realized there was a problem. As technicians pulled the footage from the security system, an even more troubling question emerged. What had happened during the hours before Princess Anne arrived? The security team expected a routine review. Instead, what allegedly appeared on screen left several officials stunned. Every movement, every stop, every glance toward the archive cabinets suddenly became the focus of intense scrutiny. By the time technicians completed the first stage of their review, the atmosphere inside the palace had changed dramatically. What had initially been treated as a possible misunderstanding was now being examined with a level of seriousness usually reserved for matters of significant institutional concern. Reports suggest security officers spent hours reviewing footage from multiple cameras, positioned throughout the library complex, carefully reconstructing a timeline that could explain exactly what had occurred. Every recorded moment was analyzed. Every entry and exit was noted. Every unexplained pause generated a new round of questions. At first, investigators believed the footage would provide straightforward answers. Instead, it appeared to create even more uncertainty. Different camera angles reportedly revealed details that had not appeared in preliminary reports. Officials began comparing timestamps, reviewing movements, and matching footage against access records gathered during the previous phase of the inquiry. What emerged was not a simple explanation, but a sequence of events that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. The review process quickly expanded beyond routine security procedures. Senior aides were reportedly briefed throughout the day as technicians assembled a complete reconstruction of the timeline. Palace insiders claimed that certain moments drew particular attention, prompting investigators to replay portions of the footage repeatedly. The goal was no longer simply determining who had entered the restricted area. The focus had shifted toward understanding intent, purpose, and whether the encounter had been part of a larger sequence of events. As details filtered through private administrative channels, concern began spreading among officials who had previously remained skeptical. Some believed the situation would eventually be explained through a procedural oversight. Others worried that the footage hinted at something more significant. The uncertainty created an environment where speculation flourished. Every new detail seemed to generate two new questions. Every answer appeared to reveal another layer of complexity. Throughout this period, reports suggest Princess Anne remained closely informed. Known for her disciplined approach to royal responsibilities, she allegedly requested regular updates as the review continued. Those familiar with palace operations claimed that Anne wanted a complete understanding of the timeline before drawing conclusions. Her insistence on facts over assumptions only heightened the seriousness of the investigation. Staff members understood that if Anne remained engaged, the matter was far from resolved. Meanwhile, reactions among palace personnel reportedly reflected growing unease. Individuals who had initially dismissed the controversy as exaggerated began paying closer attention. Administrative teams found themselves revisiting records. Security officers expanded their inquiries. Senior staff members reportedly held private discussions regarding possible implications if the investigation uncovered evidence of broader involvement. The possibility that more than one person might have knowledge of the events quickly became a central concern. That question proved especially troubling. If the footage documented unusual activity, was it truly isolated? Or did it represent only one piece of a much larger puzzle? Investigators reportedly began examining whether anyone else had entered the area earlier into the day, communicated with those involved, or possessed information that had not yet been disclosed. The inquiry was no longer focused on a single encounter. It was becoming an investigation into an entire chain of events. As pressure mounted and the timeline grew increasingly detailed, officials found themselves confronting a realization they had hoped to avoid. The footage, while important, might not contain the full truth. Cameras could reveal movements, but they could not explain motives. They could document actions, but they could not reveal what someone had been searching for, or why. To uncover those answers, investigators would need to look beyond the recordings themselves and into a collection of records that had only recently come under scrutiny. Yet the footage itself was only part of the story, because investigators soon uncovered records that appeared to deepen the mystery. What started as a simple security review quickly evolved into a palace-wide inquiry. Access logs, visitor records, and staff reports were gathered as officials attempted to understand exactly what had happened behind the library's closed doors. By this stage, the situation had moved far beyond the concerns of a small security team. What began as a question about one individual's presence inside a restricted area was rapidly transforming into a broader examination of palace procedures, permissions, and accountability. Reports suggest entire departments became involved as officials worked to establish a complete picture of the events surrounding the Windsor Library incident. Every available document was requested. Every relevant record was reviewed. What had once been a quiet internal matter was now commanding attention at the highest administrative levels of the royal household. The first priority was reportedly the access logs. Investigators carefully examined records detailing who had entered specific areas of the library and when those movements occurred. Under ordinary circumstances, These records rarely attracted significant attention. They existed primarily to ensure proper administration and security compliance. But now each entry carried potential significance. Officials searched for inconsistencies, unexplained permissions, and any indication that standard procedures may have been bypassed. Every timestamp became important. Every authorization was scrutinized. At the same time, visitor records came under renewed examination. Questions emerged regarding who had been granted access to certain sections of the building, and under what authority. Some reports suggested investigators compared visitor permissions against existing protocols, looking for anything that appeared unusual. The process was painstaking. Yet with every layer reviewed, the possibility of a simple misunderstanding seemed increasingly difficult to accept. As the inquiry expanded, palace aides reportedly found themselves facing uncomfortable questions. Individuals responsible for scheduling, administration, and security coordination were asked to clarify details that had once appeared insignificant. Conversations were revisited, communications were reviewed. Officials attempted to reconstruct not only what had happened, but also how decisions had been made in the days leading up to the incident. What initially seemed straightforward now appeared filled with uncertainty. The deeper investigators looked, the more conflicting accounts reportedly emerged. Different individuals remembered events differently. Timelines that initially appeared clear became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Some explanations aligned neatly with official records, while others raised additional concerns. Senior officials allegedly spent hours comparing statements and attempting to separate assumptions from verifiable facts. Instead of producing clarity, each comparison seemed to reveal new contradictions that demanded further investigation. Throughout the process, reports suggest Princess Anne remained unwavering in her position. Transparency, according to palace whispers, became her central demand. She reportedly insisted that every relevant detail be examined, regardless of how uncomfortable the findings might prove. Those familiar with her reputation were unsurprised. Anne had long been viewed as someone who placed duty above personal considerations, and many believed she saw the investigation as a matter of institutional integrity rather than individual personalities. Yet as questions multiplied, so did concern. The possibility of a protocol breach no longer appeared remote. Officials reportedly began discussing scenarios that only days earlier would have seemed unimaginable. Had procedures been ignored? Had permissions been misunderstood? Or had someone deliberately ventured into areas they were never meant to access? Each possibility carried consequences, not only for those directly involved, but for the credibility of the systems designed to protect sensitive royal records. Meanwhile, rumors continued spreading beyond the administrative offices where the inquiry had begun. Members of the wider royal household reportedly became aware of the growing controversy. Fragments of information traveled through private conversations, informal briefings, and quiet exchanges among staff. With every retelling, the mystery seemed to grow larger. What had started as a troubling incident was gradually becoming one of the most discussed internal controversies Windsor had faced in years. And just when investigators believed they were finally beginning to understand the scope of the situation, an entirely new development emerged from the records they had been examining. It was unexpected, difficult to explain, and potentially far more significant than anything uncovered so far. But while investigators searched for answers, another revelation threatened to make the situation even more explosive. By the following morning, whispers had transformed into full-scale speculation. Every corridor, office, and private drawing room seemed consumed by a single question. Why had Camilla's son been there at all? What had begun as a quiet internal inquiry was no longer confined to security reports and administrative reviews. The uncertainty surrounding the Windsor Library incident had taken on a life of its own. Across the palace, conversations that were once cautious and restrained became increasingly animated. Staff members exchanged theories in hushed tones. Long-serving aides compared fragments of information they had heard from different departments. Even individuals who had no direct connection to the investigation found themselves drawn into the growing mystery. The absence of definitive answers created the perfect conditions for speculation to flourish. As details continued to circulate, different factions within the broader palace community reportedly began forming their own interpretations of what had happened. Some believed the situation had been exaggerated and would ultimately be explained through routine procedures. Others were far less convinced. They pointed to the expanding inquiry, the repeated reviews of security footage, and Princess Anne's continued involvement as evidence that officials had uncovered something far more serious than they were willing to publicly acknowledge. With every passing hour, confidence gave way to uncertainty, and uncertainty gave way to suspicion. At the center of those discussions was a question that many found impossible to ignore. If access to the restricted archive section was so carefully controlled, how had the situation occurred in the first place? Reports suggest growing attention was directed toward issues of influence, authorization, and privilege. Some wondered whether established procedures had been bypassed. Others questioned whether assumptions had been made simply because of family connections. The conversation was no longer focused solely on one individual. It had evolved into a broader examination of access, accountability, and the responsibilities that came with proximity to the royal institution. Meanwhile, word of the controversy reportedly reached increasingly senior levels of the royal household. Briefings were said to have been prepared. Updates were allegedly circulated among key officials. Members of the wider family became aware that a situation initially viewed as administrative was rapidly becoming political. Every new development seemed to carry consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the library itself. The issue was no longer about a room or a collection of records. It was becoming a test of trust within one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world. Outside official channels, fragments of the story allegedly began reaching individuals with connections to the media. At first, only vague references surfaced. There were whispers of an inquiry, rumors of security reviews, questions regarding restricted access. No complete picture emerged, but experienced observers understood that even small leaks could generate significant attention. Palace officials reportedly became increasingly aware of the risks. If the matter entered the public arena before the investigation concluded, controlling the narrative could become nearly impossible. That possibility created a new layer of pressure. What had once been a private concern now carried the potential for public embarrassment. Senior administrators reportedly feared that speculation outside the palace could move faster than facts within it. Every delay seemed to increase the likelihood of exposure. Every unanswered question risked becoming another rumor. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. For palace leadership, the challenge was becoming almost impossible to manage. They faced demands for answers from multiple directions while still attempting to determine the truth themselves. Maintaining confidence required certainty, yet certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. The investigation continued, the rumors multiplied, and the pressure mounted. Amid all the noise, however, one person appeared increasingly determined to cut through the confusion. While others debated possibilities and worried about consequences, Princess Anne reportedly reached a conclusion of her own. If the answers were not emerging quickly enough, she would ensure they were found. The inquiry had already revealed more questions than anyone expected, and Anne seemed prepared to push further than many believed possible. As speculation spread beyond Windsor's walls, Princess Anne prepared to take matters into her own hands. Few figures in royal life command respect quite like Princess Anne. Known for her uncompromising commitment to duty, she reportedly refused to allow unanswered questions to linger. If there was a truth hidden within the Windsor Library incident, she intended to find it. As concern continued spreading through the palace, Princess Anne's role in the investigation reportedly became impossible to ignore. What had initially been handled through routine administrative channels now carried the unmistakable imprint of someone determined to uncover every missing piece of the puzzle. For decades, Anne had built a reputation not through headlines or public spectacle, but through relentless discipline and an unwavering belief that duty came before personal comfort. Those who worked alongside her often described a royal who demanded accountability from herself before expecting it from others. That reputation now cast a long shadow over the Windsor Library inquiry. Reports suggest Anne viewed the growing controversy as more than a simple security matter. To her, the issue touched something far deeper. Institutions survive because people trust their rules, their procedures, and the individuals responsible for enforcing them. If confidence in those systems weakened, even slightly, the consequences could spread far beyond a single incident. That belief reportedly fueled her determination to push the investigation further than many had anticipated. Additional reviews were allegedly ordered as officials revisited information that had already been examined. Security reports were reassessed. Administrative records underwent another round of scrutiny. Details that once appeared insignificant suddenly became important. Every document seemed capable of revealing a clue. Every inconsistency demanded an explanation. The inquiry was no longer moving in a straight line. Instead, it was expanding outward, uncovering connections that investigators had not expected to find. Inside the palace, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Staff members reportedly understood that the standards applied to this investigation were becoming increasingly rigorous. Individuals who had previously offered brief explanations now found themselves answering more detailed questions. Witnesses were revisited. Timelines were challenged. Small discrepancies that might once have been overlooked were carefully examined. The atmosphere grew tense as officials attempted to determine whether the unanswered questions resulted from confusion, oversight, or something more troubling. At the center of this effort stood Anne, reportedly requesting clarity at every stage. Palace whispers suggested she was unwilling to accept assumptions in place of evidence. If conflicting accounts existed, she wanted them resolved. If records appeared incomplete, she wanted them verified. Her persistence reportedly forced investigators to widen their focus beyond the original concerns that had triggered the inquiry. What started as an examination of restricted access was gradually becoming an exploration of broader patterns, decisions, and relationships that surrounded the event. As the scope expanded, new findings allegedly began emerging. Some appeared minor at first glance. Others immediately raised fresh concerns. Investigators reportedly discovered details that complicated existing explanations rather than supporting them. Information gathered from one source seemed to conflict with information obtained elsewhere. Each new revelation added another layer to a mystery that refused to become simpler. Instead of approaching a conclusion, the inquiry seemed to be uncovering deeper questions. That realization created a growing sense of unease among those following the investigation. The possibility that the incident involved more than a single moment inside the library became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Some officials reportedly began wondering whether the inquiry had only scratched the surface of a much larger issue. Others feared that answers, once uncovered, could carry consequences extending well beyond administrative procedures. For Princess Anne, however, turning back was never an option. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that the truth would not reveal itself easily. Every answer exposed another question. Every discovery pointed toward another hidden layer waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere within that expanding web of records, timelines, and testimonies, investigators appeared to be moving toward a revelation capable of changing far more than anyone initially imagined. But the deeper the investigation went, the closer it came to a revelation that could affect relationships throughout the royal household. When the final pieces reportedly began falling into place, even veteran palace insiders were left stunned. The incident was no longer viewed as an isolated misunderstanding. It had become something far larger, with implications reaching deep into royal trust and protocol. By now, the investigation had traveled far beyond the narrow questions that first emerged. Inside the Windsor Library, what initially appeared to be a matter of restricted access had evolved into a broader examination of confidence, responsibility, and the invisible bonds that held the royal household together. Reports suggest investigators had spent days assembling fragments of information from multiple sources, comparing records, reviewing statements, and reconstructing timelines. Individually, many of those details seemed insignificant. Together, however, They reportedly revealed a picture that was difficult to ignore. Palace insiders claimed the turning point came when investigators began connecting pieces of information that had previously been treated as unrelated. A timeline that once appeared fragmented suddenly became more coherent. Conversations that had seemed ordinary took on new significance when viewed alongside administrative records. Certain decisions, once dismissed as routine, allegedly attracted renewed scrutiny. What emerged was not necessarily a clear answer, but a growing realization that the situation was more complex than anyone had initially believed. That realization sent a wave of unease throughout the institution. Confidence inside the palace had already been shaken by weeks of uncertainty, but now the concern appeared to deepen. Officials who had hoped for a simple explanation reportedly found themselves confronting more uncomfortable possibilities. The issue was no longer limited to procedure. It was becoming a question of trust. Trust in systems, trust in oversight, and perhaps most importantly, trust in the people responsible for protecting the integrity of the institution itself. As those concerns intensified, senior aides reportedly began reassessing security procedures that had long been considered reliable. Questions were raised regarding authorization processes, access controls, and internal safeguards. Some officials allegedly argued that even the appearance of uncertainty could damage confidence if left unresolved. Others worried that the controversy had already exposed weaknesses that would require significant changes moving forward. The debate reflected a growing recognition that the consequences of the investigation might extend well beyond the original incident. At the same time, the human dimension of the story became increasingly difficult to ignore. Relationships throughout the royal household reportedly came under strain as speculation continued to spread. Private conversations grew more cautious. Long-standing assumptions were reconsidered. Individuals who had once operated with complete confidence suddenly found themselves wondering what information might still remain hidden. The atmosphere was no longer defined solely by curiosity. It was shaped by apprehension. For Princess Anne, however, the emerging findings reportedly reinforced concerns she had expressed from the very beginning. Palace whispers suggested she believed the inquiry had uncovered exactly why complete transparency was necessary. Every unanswered question had led investigators deeper. Every unexplained detail had revealed another layer beneath the surface. What some initially viewed as excessive caution now appeared increasingly justified. Her insistence on pursuing the truth, regardless of where it led, had transformed the course of the investigation. Yet even as new connections emerged, definitive answers remained frustratingly elusive. The inquiry had revealed patterns, raised concerns, and challenged assumptions, but it had not completely resolved the mystery. Instead, it had exposed a deeper issue facing the palace. How should an institution built on tradition respond when confidence is shaken from within? That question reportedly dominated discussions among senior officials as they prepared for decisions that could have lasting consequences. Because difficult choices were now unavoidable. Whatever conclusions emerged, the palace would need to respond. Procedures might change. Relationships could shift. Trust might have to be rebuilt. The investigation had already altered perceptions inside the royal household, and many believed its effects would be felt long after the inquiry itself ended. And as officials debated the consequences, one final question remained. What would happen next? Long after the security footage stopped rolling, its impact continued to ripple through the palace. The Windsor Library incident had exposed vulnerabilities, tested loyalties, and reminded everyone that even within the world's most famous royal family, trust remains one of the most valuable and fragile currencies of all. In the weeks that reportedly followed the investigation, the atmosphere inside the palace was said to be noticeably different. The immediate urgency may have faded, but the questions raised by the Windsor Library incident refused to disappear. What began as a concern over restricted access had evolved into something far more significant. It had become a lesson about accountability, responsibility, and the delicate balance that exists between tradition and trust. For many observers, the controversy was no longer defined by a single event. Instead, it became a symbol of how quickly confidence can be shaken when uncertainty enters, even the most carefully guarded institutions. Reports suggest palace officials spent considerable time reassessing security procedures in the aftermath. Existing safeguards were reportedly reviewed, protocols were revisited, and discussions took place regarding how future concerns should be handled. Whether changes were ultimately implemented or not, the incident appeared to leave a lasting impression on those responsible for protecting the integrity of royal operations. The belief that certain systems were beyond question had been challenged, and rebuilding confidence required more than simply closing an investigation. At the heart of the story was a theme that seemed to resonate throughout every stage of the world: inquiry, trust. Not trust in buildings or documents, but trust between people. Trust that procedures would be followed. Trust that responsibilities would be respected. Trust that personal relationships would never outweigh institutional obligations. Those questions reportedly lingered long after the most urgent concerns had been addressed. In many ways, they became the true legacy of the controversy. Throughout it all, Princess Anne's role reportedly reinforced the reputation she had spent decades building. To supporters, her determination represented an unwavering commitment to duty. While others debated consequences and worried about public perception, Anne appeared focused on one objective: ensuring that questions were answered and standards were upheld. Whether one agreed with her approach or not, few could deny that her involvement transformed the investigation. The incident seemed to strengthen her image as a guardian of tradition at a moment when many believed the institution needed exactly that. Yet the conclusion of the inquiry did not necessarily bring complete resolution. Reports suggest certain relationships within the broader royal household remained strained. Questions that emerged during the investigation could not simply be forgotten. Assumptions had been challenged. Confidence had been tested. Even after official discussions reportedly ended, the effects continued to influence private conversations and internal dynamics. The controversy left marks that were unlikely to disappear overnight. For palace officials, the focus gradually shifted toward preventing similar situations in the future. Lessons were reportedly studied, procedures were reconsidered, greater attention was paid to areas that had previously attracted little concern. The goal was not merely to respond to a single controversy, but to ensure that future uncertainties could be addressed before they evolved into larger problems. Despite those efforts, however, one reality remained unchanged. The Windsor Library incident had secured its place as one of the most discussed internal palace controversies in recent memory. Not because every question had been answered, but because some questions never were. Official silence may have reduced public speculation, yet it also ensured that curiosity endured. For every explanation that surfaced, another mystery seemed to remain just beyond reach. And perhaps that is why the story continues to captivate those who follow the royal family. The investigation may have ended, but the fascination surrounding it never truly disappeared. Somewhere between the confirmed details and the unanswered questions lies the reason people continue to revisit the controversy years later. The uncertainty itself became part of the story, because in the House of Windsor, secrets rarely stay buried forever, and sometimes a single moment caught on camera can change everything. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.